Turn her loose, 2 words from the stranger at the water trough, and that command would cost 4 armed men everything. Della Marsh's wrist was roped and her boots were cutting twin lines through the red Arizona dust, and not one of Cyrus Boon's riders had bothered to look twice at the quiet man by the water trough. That was the last clear mistake they'd ever make. Partner, before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and the bell right now if you haven't already. We put out a new story every single week, and I'd hate for you to come in late and miss the start of the next one. And while you're settling in, drop me a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. What time is it where you are? Pour yourself something warm. This one's going to take a while. Now, let's go back to where it really began. The San Pedro River cuts through the high desert of Arizona Territory, the way a long-held grievance cuts through a family, deep-channeled, persistent, shaping everything around it without appearing to move. In August of 1882, it ran heavy and brown from 3 weeks of monsoon pushing down from the Pinalinos, and the crossing at Marsh's depot was the only place for 40 miles in either direction where a loaded freight wagon could ford it without losing half its cargo to the current. That made the crossing worth something. That made it worth protecting. And Della Marsh had been protecting it, alone for 11 months before any of this came to a head. She was 28 years old that August. She had dark hair and dark eyes and hands that looked lighter than they were, calloused by 11 months of rope work and ferry maintenance and supply crate hauling and lamplight bookkeeping. The trouble had begun the September before, when a fever took Jonah Marsh in 4 hard days and left Della standing over a fresh grave in her work boots, with the full weight of the river crossing operations suddenly on her alone. She'd done what she had to do next. She'd stood over that grave and made a promise out loud, to the cottonwoods and the empty sky and to Jonah wherever he'd gone, that she was not leaving, that the depot his hands had built across 15 years of hard work was going to keep running, that she was going to be the one running it. It was not a small promise. The Marsh Depot was not a simple trading post, it was the entire infrastructure of a working river crossing. The rope and pulley ferry, the anchor posts, driven into the rock shelf beneath the current, the gravel bar system Jonah had mapped and memorized across 15 years of flood and drought seasons, the deep-cut roads on both banks that funneled freight traffic to this one manageable ford, the relationships with freighters and soldiers and mining camp supply wagons, who relied on the crossing because the next one east added half a day to their journey and the next one west was worse. Jonah had built it piece by piece since 1867, and the last 5 years of it had been profitable, which in southern Arizona in 1882 was not a thing you assumed was going to last forever. Della knew every piece of it because she'd helped build most of it. She was not a woman who needed things explained to her twice. She hired a young man named Coyote Ames to cover the physical labor Jonah had left behind, mixed blood, Apache mother and a long-gone Mexican father who'd come through long enough to leave a last name and not much else. Coyote was maybe 22 and looked younger, quiet in the deep way where silence is not absence but attention. He could read the river current from 300 yards and tell you whether the south gravel bar was passable or whether the overnight monsoon had shifted it. He could hear hooves on the south approach trail before they cleared the mesquite bend. He was loyal in the way that comes from choice rather than obligation, which is the only kind of loyalty worth having, and he'd chosen Della's side of the river without ceremony or explanation, and stayed there. Together they'd managed. Through the winter, when traffic on the freight trail thinned and the cold came down hard from the mountains, and the ferry rope stiffened in the mornings and had to be worked loose by hand before it would run true. Through a spring that brought flooding in 3 full weeks where the South Channel was impassable and the crossing income stopped entirely. Through a summer where the freighting traffic had finally begun to rebuild and the ledger was edging towards something it hadn't been in a year. Balance. She had paid every debt Jonah had left behind. The Tucson merchant debts, the Globe Iron Worker account, the small personal loans for men who'd been decent enough not to press when she was holding things together with string. She'd paid every single one. Every debt, that is, except the one she hadn't agreed to and didn't owe. Cyrus Boon ran the Western Territorial Freight Combine. On paper, it was a licensed freight brokerage and road permit service operating under a territorial charter dated 1879. In practice, it was the kind of organization that grows wherever commerce is thick enough and law is thin enough to allow it, an arrangement that had convinced a large portion of the hauling trade in southern Arizona that the combine services were essential to the smooth functioning of their business. The road permits it sold were often not strictly required by territorial law, but the combine had men who could make a freight wagon's journey complicated in ways that had nothing to do with the law. Loads went missing. Mules went lame on specific stretches of road. Axles cracked at inconvenient distances from any blacksmith. Contractors who paid the combine found these difficulties smoothed. Contractors who didn't paid in other ways. Boon was not a physically impressive man. He was short and soft-looking, with a face that gave the impression of someone's cordial uncle and eyes that gave the impression of something considerably less cordial. He'd built his operation not on personal force, but on the purchase of other people's force, on knowing which men could be paid to do a thing and which officials could be paid to look away while it was done. That was his particular genius, if you wanted to call it that, not doing the dirty work himself, but creating a system where the dirty work happened efficiently and he was never in the same room when it did. Jonah Marsh had refused to pay. He told the first combine collector to get off his property in 1880 with the kind of politeness that has iron underneath it. The second collector the following year received less politeness and considerably more iron. Jonah filed a complaint with the Territorial Surveyor's office in Tucson, a letter that sat in a pile of correspondence for months before sliding to the bottom and being filed under general inquiries and forgotten. Then the fever had come, and Jonah was dead, and Boon had transferred the freight service fee, $460, for services Jonah had never agreed to, for road permits Jonah had never used, under a contract Jonah had never signed, directly to the widow's account. He gave her 90 days. Della wrote back that she didn't carry the debt, and she enclosed clear documentation, Jonah's copy of the only freight agreement he'd ever signed with anyone, which was a 1878 pre-combined form that contained no reference to the combine's fees or assignments. She laid out the discrepancy in plain language, 2 sentences, no embellishment, and signed her name. A collector arrived the following week with 2 riders behind him, presenting the combine's paperwork. She met him at the porch with her documentation and coyote at her shoulder, and the collector left without incident. He'd come to assess the situation, not to push it yet. What he reported back to Boon was that the widow was alone, unbacked, and absolutely immovable. And that last quality was apparently the one that decided Boon to stop sending paper and start sending Harker. Harker was the big man in the canvas duster. The duster had been tan once, and was now the color of something that had been lived in for too long in too many kinds of weather. He rode a gray horse with a permanently skeptical expression, and he had a face that looked like something had tried to work it over repeatedly and eventually given up. He was not the man you sent to negotiate, and not the man you sent to serve papers. He was the man you sent when you wanted a situation to resolve in a specific direction and stay resolved. Vance rode behind him, younger by 15 years, a studied casual ease to the way he sat the saddle. The Winchester across his pommel, worn the way another man might carry an umbrella, as a permanent feature of his daily appearance. He was the kind of dangerous that was harder to read than Harker's kind, because Harker's danger was plain and Vance's had a layer of practiced nonchalance over it. The other 2 were hired day men, a red-bearded one and a plain one, present because $1 a day plus feed for the horses was available, and they had no immediate objection to the work on offer. They crossed the ford on a Monday morning in August, past 9 o'clock, with the sun already white and hot, and the river smelled sharp from the overnight surge. They came single file across the south gravel bar, which meant whoever was leading knew the crossing had either been here before or been told the exact line to walk. Della was at the ferry landing checking the tie-off ropes when she heard them come up the bank road. She straightened and watched them come. 4 horses walking, no hurry in it. Men who aren't in a hurry haven't bothered to be afraid, and men who haven't bothered to be afraid are the ones you pay attention to. Harker pulled up 10 feet from her and sat his gray without dismounting, which was a statement in itself. The combine was calling the debt. The 90 days had run. The collateral against it, the trading post, the ferry hardware, the North Bank land rights, would be recorded in the Territorial Land Office before the month was out unless she made arrangements to settle. The information landed without heat, the way a man delivers a fact he has no personal investment in but intends to see acted upon. Della's hand rested on the rope cage housing of the ferry mechanism. Her documentation was clear. The debt wasn't valid. The combine's contract attribution was fraudulent, and she had the original paperwork to prove it. Harker's face didn't move. The documentation had been reviewed, he said, and found insufficient. That last word, insufficient, sat in the air between them like something that had been decided before he rode across the ford. Vance came down off his horse. He had the short rope in his hand already, 7 or 8 feet of it, with a slip knot pre-tied at one end. He walked to Della with the unhurried confidence of a man accustomed to the particular authority that comes from having 3 armed men at his back, and the slip knot went over her wrist before she'd finished turning toward him. The cinch pulled tight. Somewhere behind her, the freighter who'd been resting on the depot porch came half out of his chair and then sat back down. A wagon driver who'd been waiting for the South Channel to clear found something interesting to look at in the direction of the corral. The world, for a few terrible seconds, arranged itself around the assumption that this was going to happen. Then from the water trough came a voice. "Turn her loose." 2 words, low and plain, the way a man says something he's already decided and is only putting into the air as a courtesy. The drifter had been at the depot since before sunrise. He'd come in quiet on a solid bay horse layered with road dust, and he'd watered the horse at the trough and bought himself a tin cup of coffee from the window counter and settled back against the post near the trough, with his hat tipped forward and his arms folded. He'd made no impression on anyone. He was lean and long-limbed and somewhere in his early 40s, weathered in the specific way the desert weathers a man, not aged exactly but rendered down to essentials, all the excess burned away. He had gray eyes that were doing something unusual, looking at all 4 of Boon's men simultaneously without appearing to look at any of them in particular. He'd been sitting there so long and so still that the horses at the rail had stopped noticing him. He straightened when he spoke. He didn't move from the trough. He didn't reach for anything. He just put his back straight and repeated himself, the same words, the same level register, no harder the second time around. Harker looked at him the way you look at a gate that's swung open when there's no wind, not afraid, but noticing that the situation has introduced a variable he hadn't accounted for. Vance smiled. Actually smiled, a short, sharp expression that said he genuinely couldn't believe the interruption. The red-bearded dayman touched his gun grip and left his hand there. The drifter's Colt came out. The draw was so clean and so fast that the sound of the hammer going back was the first real indication the gun was out of its holster. He put 1 round into the wooden trough at a precise distance from Harker's knee, close enough to make the point, far enough to be a demonstration rather than an accident. The report walked up the canyon walls and came back twice. Harker's gray shied 3 steps sideways, the freighter on the porch pressed flat against the wall behind him. In the dead air after the echo, the drifter's voice carried across the yard without effort. They were in a difficult position, he explained. The widow carried no valid debt, and that was the end of that matter. They were welcome to ride south across the ford and carry a message to Boon. The man making this statement had nothing particular on his calendar for the next several weeks, and would be glad to continue the conversation in person if Boon wanted to send someone to do that. His best days were not behind him. They were welcome to test the alternative if they preferred it, but he wanted them to have the option clearly in front of them before they decided. He had moved perhaps 1 step from the post. Vance took out the folding knife from his shirt pocket and cut the rope from Della's wrist. 2 quick strokes, and put the rope back in his saddlebag neatly, the way a careful man maintains his equipment. He didn't look at Della when he did it. He looked at the drifter with the specific expression of a man who is silently revising something important. Harker got his gray steady. He sat there another moment, and in that moment you could see something working behind his eyes, the beginning of a question he couldn't quite finish forming. Then he turned south and rode for the ford, and Vance and the 2 daymen fell in behind him, and they crossed over and disappeared into the mesquite. Now, partner, right here, before the story goes any further, let me ask you to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next story when it drops. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from tonight. What time is it where you are? Are you up late, or is it a lazy morning? Pour yourself something and get comfortable, because we're a long way from the end of this. Back to the river. Della stood in the settling dust and watched the south bank until the last sound of hooves faded into the mesquite. The rope had left a red line across her wrist bone. She was shaking. Not fear, or not only fear, but the particular cold fury that arrives when someone treats you as an object to be moved rather than a person to be answered, when someone puts a hand on you in front of your own people and calls it authority. She walked to the water trough. The drifter was reholstering his Colt with the same unhurried economy he'd drawn it with. He looked at her as she approached, no pride in his face, no expectation of thanks, no performance of any kind. Just a man waiting to see what came next. His name was John. Just John for now. He put his hands in his pockets, not looking for thanks, not waiting for it. The question was whether there was work at a river crossing for a man who didn't mind hard labor. Coyote Ames had jogged up from the ferry landing and was standing half a step behind Della's left shoulder, slightly out of breath, and his face was doing something complicated, not the look of a young man who'd seen a stranger. The look of a young man who'd seen a thing he thought he recognized from somewhere else and was working out whether he was right. Della looked at John's hands, his boots, the way he stood taking up neither more space nor less than the situation required. There was something settled about him that wasn't age. It was more like a man who had made one large decision somewhere in his past and had been living inside it ever since. The room above the storeroom was $2 a week, payable in trade labor. That sounded fair. He led the bay toward the corral. When he was far enough away, Coyote stepped up beside Della and lowered his voice. "That horse," he told her, "a bay horse, that particular shape of head, that particular way of moving, he'd seen it before. A trail near the New Mexico line 2 years back. A water claim dispute involving men from a Silver City cattle concern. The man who'd resolved it had ridden a bay horse. Afterward, the people who'd witnessed it had called the man something, though none of them had caught his real name." Della waited. Quiet John. That was what they'd called him. She looked at the corral for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, and went back to the ferry landing to finish checking the ropes. John Reese. His full name came out 3 days later when Della asked directly, in the flat way of a woman who wants the truth and will notice if she's getting something else. Had come into this stretch of country the way a man returns to a place he'd known before but wasn't sure he had a right to. He'd been through the San Pedro Valley years back, when the trading post sign had been a plank of raw pine and the north road had been a single rutted track. He hadn't recognized the place immediately. But the sign on the post, Marsh said stop it, had stopped him where he stood. He knew the name Marsh. Not Jonah directly. But in 1868, in a mining camp in the Superstition country east of Phoenix, a man named Marsh had done a specific thing for a 26-year-old deputy who'd found himself boxed into a corner by a crooked mining agent's paperwork. Marsh had walked into the agent's office with a counterclaim document the agent couldn't refute, laid it on the desk and stood there until the man signed the dismissal and walked out. He'd done it without being asked, and without expecting anything in return, and by the time anyone thought to thank him, he was already gone. Word of that kind of thing travels the same circuits as word of bad deeds, only slower and quieter, and John had been carrying the weight of it for 14 years without knowing what to do with it. He hadn't planned what happened at the water trough. He'd watched Harker's men come across the ford, and he'd sat very still and watched. And when the rope went on Della's wrist, he'd done what seemed like the obvious thing. Not noble, just obvious. He worked the first 3 days without commentary, relaying the top courses of the north wall's adobe brickwork where the summer rains had softened the mud seam, cutting and splitting cottonwood for the ferry break housing, helping Coyote retension the main ferry cable in a 4-hour job that required one of them to be chest deep in the river for most of it. He did the cold water stretch without mentioning it. Coyote Ames made up his mind about John on the second day. He didn't say so. He just stopped watching the corral when John went to feed the horses. The third night, past midnight, Harker came back, alone, on foot, feeling his way across the gravel bars in the dark with the practiced certainty of a man who'd scouted the route in daylight and committed the steps to memory. Coyote had been watching the south approach every night since the rope incident, sleeping light and shallow, positioned near the landing, and he woke John with a single touch on the boot sole. John was already sitting up. He went out without a lamp and stood at the bank landing in the dark. Harker was on the bank with his arms loose at his sides and his hands open and visible, which is the gesture a man makes when the first thing he needs to establish is that he hasn't come to fight. He got right to it. He'd spent 3 days trying to place something. Not the speed of the draw, he'd seen fast draws before, but the quality of it. The complete absence of theater. Most men who were very good with a gun had a kind of performance about them, a staging, even the truly dangerous ones. This man had none of that. He'd drawn his Colt the way you open a door. It had been nagging at Harker, and the night before it had come clear, a marshal's deputy in Lordsburg, New Mexico, 2 years back, describing a man who'd walked into a hostage situation with 8 armed men and talked it down to 1 shot before anyone had processed what was happening. Gray eyes that looked at everything at once. A bay horse. They call you Quiet John. Harker put it out there without turning it into a question. A long quiet between them. The river moved. An owl called once from the cottonwoods on the south bank. John didn't deny the name. Names had a way of growing larger than the events that made them, and he'd learned not to put too much weight on either side of the ledger. Harker nodded, like that answered something he'd been working out. Another pause, and then he got to the reason he'd crossed the ford at midnight. Boon didn't know. If Boon had known who was at the crossing, the approach would have been different from the start. Different men, different method, different scale. He was telling them this because what had happened with the rope hadn't been right, in his view, and he was arriving at an age where the things he'd done for men whose version of right he hadn't examined closely enough had started to collect on him in ways he hadn't planned for. And then the practical matter. Boon was not a man who let things go. He had a county sheriff on the payroll, Packard, whose supplemental income from the combine didn't appear in any county record. When Boon wanted a property filing to happen, it happened. A paper complaint would go through Packard's office before it went anywhere useful. Harker turned and walked back across the ford. His footsteps on the gravel were deliberate and unhurried. The dark took him. John stood at the landing until the river sound had fully settled back around the space where those footsteps had been. Then he went in and sat in the storeroom with the lamp out, and thought through the shape of what was coming and the shape of what was possible, and the thinking took until about 5 in the morning. He laid it out for Della at first light, at the table in the back of the storeroom with coffee between them. The sheriff arrangement changed everything about the legal approach. A formal complaint would arrive at Packard's desk before it arrived anywhere else, and Packard's desk was Boon's desk. The debt was fraud, and anyone who examined the documents clearly knew it, but clear knowledge and a workable legal remedy existed in 2 different worlds in a county, where the law had been purchased and the purchase went undocumented. The only language that would reach Boon was the language of cost. Not the cost of losing. Boon's position wasn't that vulnerable, but the cost of continuing. You made maintaining the current approach more expensive than abandoning it, and you made that visible to him in terms he actually understood. That meant getting ready. She wanted to know what getting ready looked like. John turned his coffee cup in his hands. 3 or 4 days of work, using the landscape. Not expecting anything to unfold the way you planned for it, nothing ever did. He'd need Coyote's help. Was Coyote the kind of man who could be counted on to do a difficult thing without needing it explained 3 times? Coyote Ames, Della told him, had been doing difficult things without explanation since before he was old enough to need them explained at all. Good. They'd start in the morning. He spent the first full day walking the perimeter, slowly, deliberately, stopping and crouching and looking at angles and distances and the relationship between structures and tree line and the way light fell across the open ground at different times of day. He spent considerable time on the south bank of the ford, looking back at the depot from the direction that trouble would approach, seeing it with the eyes of the men who would be coming in the dark. He and Coyote spent 2 days talking, not in the way of men giving orders and receiving them, but in the way of 2 people who both know the terrain and are both intelligent and are working out the best use of that knowledge together. Coyote drew a map in the dirt with a stick, and John crouched over it and studied it with the patience of a man for whom patience was not an effort, but a tool. He had specific questions. The depth of the scrub on the east approach at the fence line, how far sound carried across the water at night when the wind was from the south, whether there were natural choke points on the north approach between the tree line and the building wall. Coyote had answers for all of it, quick ones, specific ones, the answers of a man who had been paying attention to his immediate landscape for most of his life. They worked for 3 days. The ferry landing got a new lock on the rope cage housing, heavy iron hasp through 2 rings. Impossible to work in the dark without noise. Impossible to cut quickly without equipment. Nobody was likely to carry on a night crossing. Along the east approach, between the corral fence and the base of the north wall where a line of scrub salt cedar had grown up, Coyote ran a length of rope at ankle height, 6 inches off the ground, waited at the far end with 2 empty tin cups and the bell from the storeroom door. It wouldn't stop a moving man. It would name him the instant he arrived. Along the north approach, John cleared 30 feet of open ground from tree line to wall, scrub mesquite, salt cedar tangles, dead cottonwood saplings until the corridor was open and crossable without cover. Into that cleared ground he drove cottonwood stakes at irregular intervals, chest-high posts with shin-level cross members, not man-traps, noise-makers and stumble points, things that slowed a body in the dark and gave anyone watching from above an extra second to locate the sound and the shape. The roof was the last piece. Flat adobe, low parapet on 3 sides, 18 inches of cover if you crouched. From the southwest corner, the sight lines were clear in every direction, the ford, both approaches. 40 yards of open ground visible even in poor light if you'd been lying there long enough for your eyes to open all the way. John showed Della every inch of it, where to lie, where to move if she needed to shift position, how to stay behind the parapet and still track a moving target below without showing her head, how to find the southwest corner in the dark without a lamp, and he taught her to use the Winchester. She knew the basics. Jonah had kept it, and she'd fired at snakes, and once at a coyote that had gotten into the meal stores. But there is a real distance between a woman who has fired a gun and a woman who has been taught to use one well. And John covered that distance with her over 2 evenings with the specific patience of someone who understands which errors matter and which ones correct themselves. He focused on 2 things, her grip and her breath. Most people thought the important moment was the trigger pull. That was the wrong thing to think. The trigger pull was just the last step of something the breath had already done. You exhale past the halfway point. And right in that still fraction of a second before the next inhale begins, that's where the gun fires itself. And you just don't interfere. The gun and the target and your eye are all the same quiet thing for one moment. You hold that moment and let it pass through. She drilled it on a cottonwood post he'd set in the ground 40 yards out from the north wall. She missed 4 times in a row. He waited, no comment, while she reloaded. She hit it clean on the 5th attempt. Again, 2 syllables, nothing more. She reloaded and hit it again, and his silence afterward was, she was beginning to understand what passed for high praise in his vocabulary. The 3rd evening he came up on the roof just before dark, and they sat together with the river going copper below them and the Rincons going purple on the eastern horizon. She put the question to him that she'd been holding for 3 days. How had he come to be this particular kind of man? He looked at the mountains for a while. Then, Cobre Wells. 15 years ago, he'd been a deputy there, young and certain the way young men are certain before the world has had time to demonstrate where the certainty stops. There was a land baron named Crail who had decided his claim to the North Fork water rights extended to the question of whether anyone in the territory had a right to drink water he hadn't purchased from Crail. The county sheriff had money from Crail. The money converted the sheriff's judgment into something else. John had stayed and pushed back on his own account when the sheriff wouldn't, and what followed hadn't gone the way he'd hoped. 3 men died in the space of 2 days. None of them were innocent in any clean sense of the word, but 2 of them were on his accounting. And you didn't walk away from that kind of arithmetic the same person who walked into it. He'd been a lot of things since Cobre Wells. A scout, a hired man of various descriptions, a deputy in 2 other counties briefly, before it became clear that wearing a star had a way of making you the representative of whoever issued it. And the people who issued stars were not always the people whose version of justice he was prepared to represent. The one thing he'd come to know with certainty was that men like Boon were all operating the same mechanism, regardless of what they called it and what forms they used to paper it over. The mechanism was simple. It assumed nobody was going to push back. That was the whole structure. Not strength, not actual legal authority, not superior force. Just the reliable probability that most people would decide the personal cost of resistance was too high, because it usually was. John had arrived at a different answer to that calculation, for reasons he'd never fully articulated even to himself. She sat with that for a moment. The river settled. Somewhere below them a night heron called once, from the cattails at the bend. She'd been making her own version of the same calculation, she told him, every morning for 11 months, alone, with no one watching and no one keeping count. He turned and looked at her directly. She held his gaze without flinching. He said she had. And that calculation made every day in the quiet, without drama or audience, made her more qualified for the kind of steadiness she'd been showing than most people he'd worked alongside in the course of his life. She was still afraid, though. Not of Boon's men specifically. That was just the shape fear had taken most recently. What scared her was the general fragility of all of it, the ropes that held the ferry, the accounts that needed tending every week without fail, the single bad season that could undo what Jonah had spent 15 years building. Knowledge wearing fear's clothing, that was what John would have called it, and he wouldn't have been wrong. She asked if that made sense to him. He said it made more sense than most of what he encountered, which she decided was the most indirect form of reassurance she'd ever received. Something moved briefly in his expression, not quite a smile, something quieter than a smile. They went to their positions every evening for the next 2 nights. Coyote at the landing, Della on the roof at the southwest corner, lying flat with the Winchester across her forearms and her cheek, not quite touching the stock yet, saving that contact for when it mattered. John anywhere the ground told him to be, which was different each night, because a man who kept a pattern was easier to plan around than the landscape itself. The waiting had its own weight. Not the dramatic tension of a story, but the real thing, the specific heaviness, of watching a door and not knowing which minute it was going to open. She got through it by staying with the river sound and the feel of the stockwood under her palm and the breath practice, which it turned out had uses beyond accuracy. Boon sent his men on the 5th night. Past 2 in the morning, the moon gone behind a cloud bank that had been building from the south all day. 7 of them crossing the ford in single file on the south gravel bar, Vance out front with his Winchester. They came up the north bank and split without hesitation. 4 going east toward the corral approach, 3 going north toward the clear corridor between the wall and the tree line. They moved like men who'd been briefed on the layout, which meant someone had walked the property in daylight at some point. Harker was not among them. What that told you about Harker was something. Coyote lay on the roof in the dark with his face inches from the parapet edge and watched them come. He gave the signal. 1 owl call, a breath, a second owl call. John was already at the storeroom door. The east group hit the rope line at 22 yards out. The bell rang sharp and clear. The tin cups rattled and clattered, and one of the 4 went down hard across the cross-member stakes in the cleared dirt with a crash that carried across the full yard. The 3 remaining in that group stopped moving instantly. John came out the storeroom door and moved along the north wall to the northwest corner. He put his back to the adobe and listened to the dark with the attention of a man who has learned to read the information in silence. The kind of stillness that has a body in it versus the kind that doesn't, the direction a held breath comes from, the location of something that's trying to be still because movement is dangerous. He called out clearly into the dark. They'd been heard at the ford. Every angle of this building had a gun on it. Nobody present needed to get hurt tonight. Every man who walked back across that river would walk back uncontested. He was saying it once more, and after that the offer was closed. Vance fired at the roof. The round hit the parapet 8 feet from Della and drew a crack of adobe dust across her hands and face. She didn't move. She was where she was supposed to be, doing what she'd been told to do, and her breath was where it needed to be. John put 2 rounds into the earth at Vance's feet. The second was within half a second of the first, close enough together that they sounded like one ragged report, and the second throw of dirt hit Vance's boot. Vance went flat in a single dropping motion, not shot, not wounded, just suddenly and involuntarily horizontal on the ground. One of the north approach men turned and ran back for the ford without any further deliberation. 2 of the east group followed him within seconds. That left 3 men standing in the open night, and the silence that held between them and the building lasted approximately 4 seconds. The precise duration of time a hired man needs to complete the arithmetic on whether $1 a day is still the most relevant number in the equation. They ran. Vance lay on the ground for 90 seconds. Coyote watched him from above. Della watched him from behind the parapet with the Winchester's front sight just above the low adobe wall. John watched him from the corner. Not a word, not a movement. Just the 4 of them holding the silence while the river ran below and the stars were very bright where the clouds had parted. "I'd like to get up," Vance said from the ground, not asking exactly. More like stating a preference and waiting to see if there was a credible objection. Nobody objected. Vance rose, picked up his Winchester without pointing it at anything, and walked south toward the ford at a measured pace. On the near bank he turned and looked back at the building, not at any person in it, just at the shape of it in the dark, as if cataloging something for future reference. Then he stepped onto the gravel bar and crossed over, and the south bank mesquite swallowed him. John held his position for 20 minutes. So did Coyote. So did Della, who did not climb down from the roof until John came to the base of the ladder and put his hand flat on the bottom rung, a gesture that meant clear. That meant over. That meant she could come down. She came down with the Winchester in her hand and stood in the empty yard with the river sound around her and the stars overhead, and said nothing at all for a while. He stood a few feet away and said nothing either. That felt right. There wasn't anything useful to say to a woman who'd held her position in the dark for 3 hours and hadn't moved when a round hit the wall 8 feet from her head. The moment was its own statement. 3 days later, a government rider came from the Territorial Land Office in Tucson. The Western Territorial Freight Convine's operating charter was under formal review, the notice said, pending a territorial inquiry into business practices in 4 southern counties. The inquiry had been filed by a freight contractor named Daughtry, who'd hired a territorial attorney and produced documented evidence of fraudulent contract assignment and coercive enforcement going back 4 years. Della read it twice at the storeroom table, folded it, set it down. She'd known there was something John hadn't told her. She could feel the shape of it in the way he'd moved through the situation, not like a man who'd stumbled onto a widow's trouble, but like a man who'd arrived with a purpose he hadn't fully disclosed. She let it sit for 10 days, waiting for him to bring it up himself, which was a courtesy she extended and which he used. On the 11th day, she asked him directly, had he known about the inquiry before he arrived? He had. 3 weeks before coming to the crossing, he'd passed through Benson and had a conversation with Daughtry's attorney in a saloon. The kind of conversation that starts as general curiosity and doesn't stay that way. The inquiry had been in motion long before he arrived. He hadn't started it, but he'd known it was coming to a head, and he'd known what it would mean for the Combine's operations in this county. And he'd placed himself at the crossing because he'd seen the Marsh name on a freight notice in Tucson, and he'd owed that name for 14 years, and this seemed like the moment to pay something toward the account. Della held his gaze for a long moment across the table. She was deciding something. She'd always been better at receiving plain dealing than misdirection, she told him, and next time she hoped he'd consider skipping the middle portion. He allowed that was fair. It was more than fair, she said. It was a practical preference, and she'd appreciate him remembering it going forward. She said it without heat, which meant she meant it. Sheriff Packard resigned his commission 8 days after the inquiry was announced, citing personal matters he declined to specify. The new acting sheriff came from New Mexico, a man named Creed who had worked as a deputy marshal and who had opinions about freight combines that no one had needed to purchase and were therefore his own. The inquiry ran through the fall and produced a documented accounting of the combine's operations, fraudulent contract attribution, coercive enforcement, improper arrangements with county officials in 4 districts, and Boon's charter was formally revoked that October. Boon was gone before the revocation was official. His Tucson office was found empty on a Tuesday, door unlocked, cold coffee in the pot. He surfaced briefly in California, then he was simply not found, which in those days meant he'd either remade himself in a territory that didn't know his name, or he'd run far enough west to run out of continent. Either outcome was acceptable. Harker went north and found an honest job on a cattle ranch in Colorado. By the accounts that drifted back south, he was reliable, kept his own counsel, and didn't cause trouble for anyone. He'd arrived at a kind of wisdom by the longest possible road, which is a route available to most men if they live long enough and accumulate enough discomfort about the choices they've made. The $460 debt was formally nullified by the Inquiry Board in November and struck from the Territorial land records. Della received the written notice on a Tuesday morning and read it at the storeroom table and folded it into the ledger next to the page where Jonah's last accounts were entered in his careful, slanted hand. John Reese left on a Wednesday in late September, 2 weeks before the inquiry's final ruling. He'd told her the evening before, simply, without building up to it, while they were sitting on the porch with the sun going down over the Rincons. He was going to move on the next morning. The work was done. She nodded because she'd expected it, and there was no purpose in pretending otherwise. She'd understood from very early what kind of man he was. The kind who moved through the world doing specific necessary things and then moving on, because the next thing that needed doing was always somewhere else. That was not a failing, it was a shape of life like any other. She made him a real breakfast the next morning, eggs and salt pork and proper biscuits with lard in the dough. Not the everyday kind, but the company kind, with good coffee from a tin she'd been rationing since spring. He ate the way he did everything, present, unhurried, without ceremony and without waste. A coin on the table when he finished. She told him to leave it. He did. There wasn't an argument worth having. At the door he turned back. The hard part was over, he said, but the work wasn't. A river crossing needed tending every single day, and the world didn't pause its supply of difficulty just because last week's particular difficulty had moved on. She knew that. She'd been doing it since before he'd arrived, and she intended to do it long after he was gone. She didn't need him to tell her. He nodded once. He looked at her with those gray eyes that looked at everything simultaneously and saw it all with the same steady clarity. And whatever he decided about what he saw was visible in the nod without needing to be put into words. He rode the bay south across the ford, found the gravel bar without looking for it the way a man finds a familiar path in the dark, and came up the south bank and kept going into the mesquite without looking back. The sound of his horse's hooves faded downstream, and then the river filled the space where the sound had been. Coyote Ames came to stand beside Della at the landing. They watched the south bank together for a while. After a time, Coyote spoke, quietly, the way he did most things. Quiet John was the kind of man who made a place safer just by having been in it, he thought. The safety stayed even after the man had gone. Della thought that was right. Did John know that about himself? Coyote wondered. She doubted he thought about it in those terms. He struck her as more the kind of man who was already looking toward the next situation than back at the last one. Coyote turned that over for a moment and then nodded. That was probably exactly what made it true. She went back inside and opened the ledger. In the months that followed, Della Marsh added 2 things to the depot. The first was a second ferryman, a solid young man from Globe who worked the dawn shift while Coyote worked the afternoon, so the crossing could run full daylight hours without burning either of them down to nothing. The second was 2 shelves of books in the northeast corner of the storeroom, lit by a green glass lamp she ordered from a Phoenix cataloger who sold books in the back pages of his dry goods list. Travelers started to come in not only for flour and salt and tobacco but to look at the titles, and to sit for a cool hour in the storeroom shade and read. Word spread north and south along the freight trail the crossing at the San Pedro had books. Within a year she was stocking 12 titles at a time and ordering replacements monthly, and the storeroom in the evenings had a different quality about it, a quieter kind of busy, more purposeful, less merely transactional. Nobody asked why she'd done it. If they had, she'd have said, because Jonah always meant to. And because she'd decided a long time ago that keeping his depot meant keeping the best of what he'd intended for it, not just the planks and ropes and revenue. You keep faith with the dead by continuing their good work, not by ending your own. Partner, I've been with this story for a good long while tonight, and I'll tell you what stays with me most. It's not the shots in the ground at Vance's feet, or the rope cut from Della's wrist, or even Harker walking across that ford at midnight to do a thing he didn't have to do. What I keep coming back to is Della Marsh going inside and opening the ledger. 11 months before John Reese ever showed up at that water trough, she'd been holding that crossing together by herself. Every morning, without anyone watching or keeping count. She'd made a promise over a grave in her work boots, and she'd honored it daily through a winter and a flood and a summer's slow recovery and a collection of paper threats from a man who'd decided her grief made her weak. She'd paid every debt that was actually hers. She'd organized her documentation. She'd met collectors at the porch with her evidence in hand. She'd done all of it alone, without recognition and without the story getting told. John Reese didn't save Della Marsh. He arrived at the right moment with specific skills and a 14-year-old debt to a name he'd been carrying without knowing what to do with. And he did what the situation asked of him, and then he moved on. But she was already saving herself. She'd been doing it every day. She just needed one man to walk up to a rope and say the right 2 words for long enough that everything else could come clear. There are more Della Marshes in the world than there are stories written about them. People who hold things together by deciding, in the dark and alone, that they are not leaving, who make that promise over a grave or a ledger or an empty chair, and then get up the next morning and make good on it again. The West was not built by the gunslingers who rode in to resolve things, however useful they were at the right moment. It was built by the people who stayed and tended and kept working past the point where stopping would have been the reasonable choice. The people who stayed are the ones who built anything worth building. If tonight's story gave you something, I'd be grateful if you hit that like button and subscribed before you go. It's what keeps this fire going and what brings you the next story when it drops. Share it with someone who'd appreciate a good Western tale, someone who understands that the real ones aren't always the loudest. And drop me a comment telling me where you are tonight and what time it is there. I read every single one of them. On the quiet nights, those comments are what make this feel like company rather than a man talking to himself in the dark. Till our trails cross again, partner. Keep your powder dry and your soul honest. All characters, names, events, and locations are invented. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is coincidental. It is intended for entertainment purposes only. All characters, names, events, and locations are invented. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is coincidental.